Hi, I'm Brian Ma, Vice President of Client Devices for Asia Pacific and Worldwide at IDC, and I'll be talking to you today about the exciting new realm of augmented and virtual reality. So let's start off first with some quick definitions of how we would define virtual reality versus augmented reality. Now, virtual reality is, I guess to put it simply, where the surroundings around you are removed. Basically, you can't see out of the head-mounted display or the goggles, so you can't see the real world around you. You are basically completely sealed off in this virtual environment, such as in this particular game, which is available on the HTC Vive, where you are completely underwater and you can't really see the room around you. Now, that is in contrast to augmented reality, which is, as you can see in the illustration here, a case where you can basically see through the glasses or the head-mounted display, and the virtual objects are rendered on top of real-world objects. The example that you see here is from Microsoft with its HoloLens, and these virtual objects done in Minecraft are rendered on top of real-life objects like furniture. Now, to be sure, some vendors, including Microsoft with their HoloLens, don't like to call their product augmented reality. They actually call it they throw it into a third category that they call mixed reality. The idea being that things like Microsoft HoloLens are much more sophisticated than something as simple as Google Glass, which is in many ways just a heads-up display that you can throw on top of the real world. Whereas Microsoft HoloLens has the ability for spatial recognition and being able to be basically much more sophisticated than Google Glass. Now, to be clear, here at IDC, we count those both under augmented reality. It's just that we separate or can split within that augmented reality umbrella, we can split it between a so-called basic versus advanced version of augmented reality. But just wanted to point that out since, again, in this very new industry, a lot of the industry players are trying to talk about a third category called mixed reality, whereas we count that under the augmented reality space, but just split between basic and advanced. So let's take a look at the hardware involved, and more specifically, what we call the head-mounted displays, or HMDs. These can be split into three major categories, the first of which is screenless viewers here on the left. That's basically like your Samsung Galaxy Gear. Huawei's got one as well too. Basically, you can slot your smartphone into this plastic shell, if you will. I mean, there are some electronics and switches and a couple sensors here and there, but it's pretty simple. Most of the electronics are sitting in the smartphone itself. Keep in mind, by the way, that Google Cardboard is excluded from this category, but it's the same general concept, right? Use your existing smartphone and plug it into one of these displays. Now, the second category is what we call tethered head-mounted displays. Tethered meaning, of course, there's a wire that runs back to something else that is, doing a lot of that compute power. In the first example there at the top, it could be the Sony PlayStation VR, which connects to a PlayStation 4, or in the case of some of the ones you've probably heard of already, Oculus Rift or HTC Vive, usually plugging into a very high-powered desktop PC. Lastly, we have the standalone head-mounted displays such as the Microsoft HoloLens or the Sulon Q there at the bottom. It's a Canadian company. These are, again, self-contained head-mounted displays where the electronics and battery are all in that head-mounted display itself, so you don't have any wires dangling from it. So what are we expecting then out of these spaces in the upcoming years? And what kind of volumes are we expecting? Well, let's start first with the screenless viewers. The screenless viewers here on the left are frankly going to be the biggest volumes, right? It's pretty obvious why. Everybody already has a smartphone, or at least many people do. The screenless viewers are basically the cheapest of them all too. In many cases, the smartphone vendors are giving them away for free, or in some very creative instances, they're actually using the head-mounted display as the packaging for the smartphone itself. But anyway, the point being is that screenless viewers are going to be most people's first experience with VR, or at least 360-degree video, which is almost close enough to VR. Now, the problem is, of course, that the experience isn't that great in the sense that the GPU, or the graphical processing unit, in a smartphone is not as heavy duty, if you will, as one that sits in a console or a PC. So in that sense, basically the graphics are going to be much more limited in its realism, but nonetheless, this is one way that one way that most people are going to be experiencing VR for the first time. Now, having said that, though, what about console-based VR? Because obviously when you're using something like a PlayStation 4, the ability to render good graphics is going to get much better. And so actually that's where we're going to see most of the volumes in the next couple of years, particularly as Sony rolls out the PlayStation VR. They already have a 34 million unit installed base of PlayStation 4 users that they can cater to. And it's frankly, like I said, it's going to be a more compelling graphical experience. But that still doesn't compare to a PC-based VR experience, which is frankly some of the best experience out there. And the reason is because, again, of the GPUs, the graphical processing units. These are powered by systems that are oftentimes $1,000 and many times significantly more than that. But the experience that you get is much greater. The flip side of that, of course, is it is a very high price point, right? That $1,000 price point is just for the PC alone, let alone the head-mounted display and the controllers. And frankly, it's also quite difficult to set up. So one of the challenges that we're going to see is whether or not PC-based systems can get much bigger. For right now, it'll still be very small until GPU prices come down. The good thing is we have actually been seeing more momentum in this direction. Both NVIDIA and AMD, particularly in the most recent months, in the middle of 2016, have already been able to bring prices down such that the starting prices of some of these desktops, PCs, can come down to about $800 in certain cases. So it's coming down a little, but until those GPU prices come down, we're more likely to see console-based VR being bigger than PC-based VR. Then lastly, we have the standalone VR, or AR in many cases, on the right. And in those cases, we are talking about very high price points, right? The developer edition of the Microsoft HoloLens is $3,000. On a much more extreme end, the Canon M-Reel starts at $125,000, and that's excluding the $25,000 a year service fee. Now, of course, not all of them are going to be that expensive, but you can see what I'm getting at. They're going to be relatively more expensive than the other two on the left, and thus generally aren't really going to be for consumers. However, it is something that we do expect to see businesses see quite a bit of value in, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But again, the main point is that the high cost of these products on the right means that it'll take a little longer for those products to really start taking off in bigger volumes. So here's a forecast of our head-mounted display shipments through the next 5 years. And you can see the dark blue represents virtual reality, the light blue represents augmented reality. And based upon the comments I was making earlier, we do expect to see virtual reality, a lot of that being consumer-driven virtual reality around gaming and so forth, will be the thing that helps to drive the volumes in the early years, as well as, of course, the smartphone-based systems. Now, the augmented reality in the light blue is what's going to take a little longer. Again, price points need to come down, the software ecosystem needs to be in place, businesses need to realize how it can be worked into their business process, so it will take a little while. But if we were to hypothetically extend this chart 5 more years out to the right, you could arguably have a much stronger light blue portion than the dark blue in the longer term. Again, the idea being that we do expect a lot of businesses to find significant value in ROI and frankly competitive advantage in deploying augmented reality solutions. And that's really going to become much more clear and obvious to them. So in the longer term, we do expect to see more of that momentum. Now, another way of looking at this market is from a consumer versus commercial perspective. So if we look at this pie chart here on the left, this represents the VR hardware shipments, head-mounted display shipments by segment in the year 2020, split by consumer commercial. And like I mentioned earlier, we do expect on the VR side for this to be a largely consumer-driven phenomenon, as again, a lot of the momentum that we're even seeing today is really a lot of games and so forth. Now, it's not to say that there's no opportunity on the commercial side. We do expect quite a bit of implementations, and in fact, we're already seeing some implementations on this. Good example would be BMW is already using the HTC Vive in its automobile design. We're seeing interesting anecdotes of travel agents using smartphone-based VR to help sell tour packages, right? If you want a 2-week tour of Italy, well, put on this headset, you're going to get a quick preview of, oh, there's the Leaning Tower of Pisa, there's the Colosseum, whatever it might be. It helps them to sell package tours. Even in real estate in Singapore, we've seen cases where a developer's trying to sell property of a building that hasn't been constructed yet. Well, how he helps to sell these yet to be built properties is by rendering the images of these units in VR. And so actually that 18% commercial figure could even be a little bigger, you could argue. But nonetheless, the point being is that at least initially, the bulk of the volumes will be on the consumer side. Now, shifting gears to the right side then, this is augmented reality, again in 2020, split by consumer and commercial. And you can see it's the other trend, it's the reverse trend, right? More of the units are on the commercial side. And the reason for that is, again, to the point I was making earlier, a lot of these are higher price points, but there are going to be cases where, many cases, I should say, of where businesses can implement these and get significant return on investment and competitive advantage by moving forward with such solutions. Whereas the consumer side, not everyone's going to be paying that kind of money just to play Minecraft on a HoloLens, even though of course there will be some. So we do have a little bit of a consumer segment there. And if anything, the recent phenomenon with Pokemon Go on a smartphone is further helping to give this whole perception of AR a big boost in the mass market. Now, granted, again, the Pokemon Go phenomenon is smartphone-based, standalone smartphone-based, or rather I should say, it's a smartphone without a head-mounted display, so we're not capturing it in the market here. But should similar things come along, maybe that consumer portion in the dark blue is bigger than 17%. Bigger than we're stating here. Nonetheless, again, the point being made here is that in at least the next few years, it will still largely be a commercial phenomenon, or at least adopted more on the commercial side than it will be on the consumer side. So what are some of the examples of these commercial usage models? Well, there's plenty of them, but just as a starter, one of which is in the healthcare space. You can imagine being able to visualize a human body in 3 dimensions, being able to walk around that body, and being able to go through layers of that body. It significantly changes how things are done. And think also in terms of medical school, right? The use of cadavers maybe can even be reduced in the sense that now you can actually open up a human skull virtually, get through the various layers of the skull to get straight to the brain material, if you will, and again, doing that all virtually. So it can create significantly different ways with which we do things in sectors like the medical sector. What's another sector? What about computer-aided design, right? If you look at things like automotive design here, or even architecture, right? Microsoft likes to say that architects today do their design on a flat 2-dimensional screen. Well, now they have the ability to physically walk around, scooch down, or stand up and look downwards, basically visualize their designs from multiple angles and physically being able to move around that. It significantly changes the way that they can do things. And you can start to let your imagination run wild here on all the other vertical sectors that this can start to apply to. It significantly changes things for businesses, and that's why this sector really starts to get exciting. So just a final example here, and again, this is just one of many examples that could be given, but if you think about things like airlines, right, or airports, I should say. Let's say there is a plane that's grounded at Singapore Changi Airport. Maybe the technician has run into a difficult technical challenge he's never seen before, needs to radio back to an engineer at Boeing headquarters in Seattle, and that engineer can see what the technician on the ground is seeing, can say, oh no, it's that screw or that piece or whatever it is. That's the thing that you need to address. It can help. The amount of time savings, the amount of advantage that can provide is quite significant. Caterpillar, for that matter, the industrial equipment company, says that 30% of their service calls that they do, of all the service calls they do, 30% of the time that they spend on each service call is just trying to get information about the problem. And so again, when you can think of how tools like this can significantly change and improve